So the first thing I wanted to do when creating my document was I first wanted to create the image I would use for the double page spread. Now, for the basic layout of the document, I went for an A4 page, as that was around the size I wanted to end up for with the actual magazine itself. Once I had this document, I needed the image, so I went to Place, and I placed the image of Thor, which was just a basic poster that was used for the actual film. After this, I wanted to play with the colouring a bit. I wanted to increase the colour of the cape and the lightning bolt. I wanted to make them show up more. So what I went to do for this was I increased the saturation. This meant that the colours that didn't have a lot of colour to begin with would stay roughly the same colour as they were, but the colours that were very vivid would show up a lot more. After this, I wanted to change the curves slightly to bring up the brighter colours, but to make sure that the darker colours stayed with that deep feeling that they had originally. So I brought the higher levels of the curves up, but kept the lower ones slightly darker. After this, I then zoomed in to the area that I would actually be using for the magazine, as I wanted a slightly more, I wanted a slightly closer up image of Thor. So what I did was I zoomed in the area so I could look at the colours. I then thought it was too dark, so I went to brightness and contrast and increased the brightness ever so slightly, just so you could see everything slightly clearer. But in doing so, I also increased the contrast by about half the amount I increased the brightness, just so that there was a little bit more contrast between the dark and the light, so that you still ended up with fine edges. I then went into InDesign, which was the magazine layout program that I was going to use for the actual magazine. I created a new document with 2 pages, and I started at page 2 so that we didn't have the cover. I then chose to have 3 margins. And then proceeded to create my document. Now, this was the document that I had at the time. I then decided to take the rectangular tool to create the where the image that I edited would go. I wanted it to overlap the pages slightly, but without taking up too much room on the first page. I then created a couple of text boxes so that I could see where my text would be laid out. I wanted it to cover most of the first page because it's a review and quite an important document. So I ended up creating 3 columns and then went back to them just to make sure they were all about the same size. And lastly, I went to Control, click, and I filled each of them with placeholder text, just so I could see what my ended document would look like. After this, I went to put in a title. Now, I didn't actually have a title at the time, so instead what I did was I merely put in a title that would more or less show where or how big the title would be, so that I could then more or less work around it to see how things would look in the final magazine. I then lastly went and put in a subheader. I then went over to my rectangle and I placed the image that I'd created earlier. Now, this image was much too zoomed in. So I double-clicked on the place itself, and what that meant was I could manipulate the image inside the space that are designated for it. Now, as I said when we looked at editing the image, I only wanted to use more or less a close-up image of Thor. So I decided that this was about the image that I wanted to use, with a zoomed-in image from him with just a hint of being able to see the hammer and the lightning. I then went to show that it was a high-quality display so I could see what the final image would look like. Lastly, I wanted to get some type of quote in my double-page spread that I wanted to show up very clearly. So I drew another box, and here you can see I put a text wrap around it. I then increased the higher and lower sides of it so that the text wouldn't interfere with the image once I put it in. Lastly, I went into paragraph styles in case I wanted to create some other type of paragraph style. I looked into a couple of things, such as creating an indent on one of the sides. What this meant would mean that there was a slightly larger gap on one side of the text, which I could have found useful if I'd had a lot more writing, so that it would have made the paragraphs clear that they were separate from each other. But in the end, I decided that I didn't really need it. The last thing I needed was some type of font that could work with the type of magazine I was trying to write for. I wanted something that would also work with the film. So I ended up going to DaFont, and I wanted something slightly Celtic. I wanted a sort of Celtic-looking thing that would work very well with the idea that Thor is a sort of Norse god-type figure. I looked at a couple of different fonts here, and then one that caught my eye was Stonecross. So what I went to do was I went to download this. And as you can see, it downloaded into my downloads file. I then opened it up. And then I had to install it. I installed the font. And after getting the computer to just install it after it thought there was a problem, it installed fine on my machine. I then went into Pages to look for the font and to test whether it worked properly. Now, one thing that worried me was I saw that there was only the capital letter of Stonecrest there. So I clicked on it and then noticed that the entire font wasn't there. And that was because I'd only downloaded the capitals, and maybe even the font itself only had capital letters in it. Now, I didn't want to limit myself to capital letters in the actual magazine. So, after testing that it was just a capital letter font, I ended up having to go back to DaFont and try to find a font that had both capital letters and lowercase letters. So after going back to the website, I then saw one that caught my eye, which was Stonehenge, which I noticed also seemed to have uppercase and lowercase letters in the actual word itself. So I ended up downloading this and installing it. Now this time you can see it didn't come up with a box here, which means there were no problems, so that's all I had to do. So lastly, I decided to try and test this font, so I went down to Stonehenge, and after writing a couple of words in it, I figured out that this was a good font to use. It was very noticeable as a Norse type font, but it also had capital letters and lowercase letters. Okay, so here are the basic parts of the camera. When you've got the focus wheel here, then here you've got the zoom in, zoom out wheel. You've got the f-stop control here, which changes the aperture size, and that means that you can it increases the size of the aperture, which lets in more light or less light depending on how big you make it. Here we have the ISO. Well, what the ISO lets you do is it lets you control the sensitivity of the sensor inside, which means that in lower light you can increase the sensitivity. However, it does tend to cause more grain on the image. Lastly, here we have the shutter speed. What that allows you to do is it allows you to increase or decrease how long the shutter is open for. That means that when you end up, say you're photographing a sports event, you want a high shutter speed. That means that you'll end up with very distinct, clear lines around the image. However, if you're shooting somewhere with low light and you're shooting a still image, then you'll want a longer shutter speed, which allows more light into the sensor. However, you don't need so much. The image must be still, so you need to use either. So you need to use a tripod really to stop the image being blurred.